So look, hey, it's another episode of Film Streak, and I'm here with some not new films to me, but not recently released. You know, that's the thing I gotta always kind of make sure to explain. Like, it's not about watching the latest films; it's about watching films that I've never seen before, and sometimes it means sending me down a road of new films, just in general of films that are undiscovered. Let's put it that way, right? And these films that I'm about to talk about, these are exactly what I'm looking for. And I don't necessarily focus on documentaries a lot. I do watch some documentaries and talk about them, but these three, I'll just run them all down to you right now. De Palma from 2015, J Pakula, Going for Truth from 2019, and Making Waves from 2019. These three films, these are documentaries, and I think a couple of them are on Max. One of them is on, I can't remember where I saw Making Waves. But these are all focused on filmmaking and filmmakers and some of the stories and some of the technology and the changes in the film industry. And De Palma especially is about a filmmaker who I know a lot of his films, but I don't know much about him, his inspirations, his ideas. I just know the work. And for me, for the most part, that's all I really care about. Because I think as an artist, as a creative person, your work should speak for you. And sometimes learning too much about the artist can take away from the art itself, right? Now, sometimes it can tell you why the art is what it is when you learn about the artist. And I think this film maybe does that. It sheds some light on not only who De Palma is and his background and his approach to storytelling and filmmaking, but it tells you why he made the films he made. I was always curious because by his work, he seems like a very technical and deliberate type of filmmaker. Like, he makes films with very elaborate and choreographed and structured sequences, and whether they're action sequences, whether they're dramatic sequences, they seem very planned and plotted. Like, there's no kind of looseness to his filmmaking. And it's not a bad thing, you know? I mean, the types of stories that he apparently likes to tell, which, you know, there's mention of his influence and his, let's say, homage to Alfred Hitchcock. And yet he points out very rightly in the film, in this documentary, this is a series of sequences from his films, but also just a kind of a full-length interview with him. So he's commenting on certain films and telling us stories about those and his history and what informed this or that throughout the different films that he's made. But one thing I thought he really pointed out very quickly was, yes, he's influenced by Alfred Hitchcock and the types of stories he tells and even some of the techniques. But when people claim like, well, he's kind of just ripping off Hitchcock, his claim to say, well, nobody else seems to acknowledge the techniques that Hitchcock used. They admire Hitchcock as a filmmaker and an iconic storyteller, but nobody seems to think they can do those types of sequences, like they're uncopyable. And if you're talking about from, let's say, an artist's integrity point of view, I get it. You don't want to copy a master at their work. But at the same time, if you see ways to find new angles on it, or you see ways to take it even further, to evolve it even more, why wouldn't you? And, from the films that I've seen of Hitchcock, I feel like at least De Palma took advantage of his opportunity to stage and tell stories in a more contemporary setting or style. I think it's one of those things that as an artist, you look for inspiration, you look for influences, you look for things that you admire. And it's only natural to say, well, I like that so much, I want to do something like that, or I want to do exactly that. But just out of natural growth and evolution, you will find that there's new ways to do things. And so here, I feel like we at least get to see De Palma's take on Hitchcock, but also to the point where it becomes De Palma's own style. To the point where I argue that, does anybody try to do De Palma style now? I don't really feel like that happens. And then I think that is because it is a very distinct and a very unique way of telling a story. And it's complicated. I mean, if you look at some of his films and some of the more elaborate sequences in them, they're not something you can improvise. And it's not to say you can't improvise how it's done, but you can't just pick up the camera and just start doing that. They do have to be somewhat figured out ahead of time. You know, in this documentary, he does talk about the stairway sequence in The Untouchables and how that really wasn't what it was supposed to be. It just ended up being that. And yet it's approached and the way it plays out in the film, it feels very moment by moment like this was all elaborately planned out for months, and it all makes sense. Every beat of that sequence, they feel like you couldn't remove a moment, a cut, an edit, a shot, and still have it hold together. Like it really does feel like all these things need to work this way. And that's a very unique way to tell a story. And I think a lot of filmmakers don't do that anymore. There's a lot of shorthand. There's a lot of cutting corners. There's a lot of, honestly, just omitting things for the sake of speed and for the sake of pace. And De Palma is a filmmaker who maybe is a little more classical at this point, of like taking his time, letting the camera stay on something, letting the camera hold a shot, and watching something happen. Of course, you even see in some of his films, and this is talked about in the documentary, where he does evolve that into the Steadicam work. And whether it's something like Carlito's Way, something like even in Blowout, one of the first Steadicam shots that he works with, even which I haven't seen, but I know there is a very elaborate Steadicam shot or a single take shot at the beginning of The Bonfire of the Vanities. That's one I got to add to the list. But the idea of like him taking the whole thing of just put the camera down, let the shot play out, let the actors act, let the action happen, evolving that into like, okay, now we're going to move the camera with the actors, with the action. That's a substantial evolution of the technique, right? That's where I feel like De Palma, that's his strength. It's not to say other filmmakers haven't come on and pushed it even further. Of course they have. You know, you have these action films, like straight up action films that are doing these long, unbroken takes. Something like, hell, they're even doing it in TV shows, like Daredevil did that. So, you know, that's one aspect of it, right? Is just seeing and breaking down his approach to filmmaking and staging things and storytelling. But then there's also the context of like, where does he fall in film history, let's say? And that's interesting to see him talk about his upbringing and then his kind of class of filmmakers, because it's, look, this is like the top tier class. I mean, it's Martin Scorsese, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Francis Ford Coppola, and Brian De Palma. They were all right there in the late 60s, early 70s. And they went on to create and then influence generations after them. And so here I feel like this is a filmmaker who, look, some of his films are kind of stuck in time. You know, something like Carrie, Blowout, they're very specific to those eras because of the style, because of the technology, because of whatever. And yet, you look at something like Mission Impossible, that was the beginning of a franchise that is still running today. And it has changed and it has grown since then. But that film still works today. I mean, we're talking, almost 30 years since that franchise began. When Brian De Palma, and he says it in this documentary, he's like, I went most of my career and kind of kept looking for the hit, the blockbuster. And he thought maybe it would be The Untouchables, maybe, some of the other films he had done, but they just were a little bit askew or just honestly kind of weird that they never really connected with audiences. And for whatever reason, Mission Impossible landed in his lap and he said, I can do this. I know how to do this. And I think it really lended itself to his style of filmmaking, these elaborate sequences with very unique approach to telling this story. And I remember when that film came out thinking, wow, this plot of this story is really kind of convoluted. Like it's kind of doing a lot of different things at the same time. And of course, the whole thing of like, wait a minute, Mission Impossible, the old TV show, it's about the team. It's about the IMF team. And this film ends up being just about Ethan Hunt. So how did we get here? And yet you see like the film doesn't really operate on those grounds. It does operate on the force of nature that is Tom Cruise and him willing and able to do some of the stuff that he does in that. And that carries on till today. So to think like, Brian De Palma never really influenced anything in terms of his style. Well, he did. Of course, you do see it in other films over the years, and you see little nods to his style or, some influence. But I think there's never really been another film or a filmmaker that has outright just been like, oh, here's the new Brian De Palma. Like he was when people said, oh, here's the new Alfred Hitchcock. It just hasn't happened yet. Maybe it will someday. Either way, this documentary was good for a lot of that kind of interesting behind the scenes stuff on a lot of the films, some context on him as a filmmaker. But, the thing was, it gave me a new list of films to watch. Because some of these films I do have on my watch list, but others I had never heard of. And it's not to say they were no good. I just had not heard of them. Sisters, I feel like I had heard the title, but I didn't know it was a Brian De Palma film. I didn't even know what it was about. Body Double, I had heard the title, also didn't know it was a Brian De Palma film. Bonfire of the Vanities, again, I've had that on the list for a long time. I've heard it's such a disaster, flop, whatever, that I worried that it would be a little bit of a struggle to get through. But I do want to see it. Snake Eyes, I feel like I've seen parts of it. I know there's like a thing with like a boxing match. So I know I've seen parts of it somewhere. But aside from that, like I feel like I've seen a lot of De Palma's films, especially in the 80s and 90s, around that era. There are two other films that I saw, I guess, glimpses of or parts of in this documentary, Femme Fatale. I'll see if I can find it somewhere someday. And there's another film that is not featured in this documentary, but I wonder if that's why this documentary was even put together, called Domino. It's got Nikolai Coster-Waldau, who, from Game of Thrones, right? I think, from what I can tell, that's his last film that he has done. So I don't know if he's still working. I don't know if he's got other projects going. But that was at least a great part of seeing this documentary, was learning about not only the filmmaker himself, but some new films for the list. And, I got to say, the same goes for Alan Pakula going for the truth, where there are some films that I did not realize Alan Pakula did. And yet, All the President's Men, of course, for me, I think that's probably like in my top 10, somewhere up in there. It's a masterwork, not only in filmmaking, but in the writing, in the performances, all around. It is one of the better films I think I've ever seen. And Presumed Innocent, which is interestingly enough, it's being remade. It's airing right now on Apple TV Plus as a series with Jake Gyllenhaal. I remember seeing this film. I only saw this maybe a few years ago, but to me, that was one I did not know he did until I just recently saw it. And there are some other films that I've heard of since forever, but I didn't know he was behind them. The Devil's Own with Harrison Ford and Brad Pitt. Sophie's Choice, which I think for a lot of people is probably one of Meryl Streep's strongest roles. And to the point where even if you don't know that film, you may have heard the term, oh, that's a real Sophie's Choice. And maybe you don't even know what that's referring to. I know what it's referring to in terms of the film. I've just never seen the film itself. So one of those things, like a film or a title that has kind of stood the test of time, even if people don't know the work, hey, yeah, that's iconic right there, right? So some of those films, there's others that are here that I definitely want to see. I've added some to the list. Starting Over, See You in the Morning, The Pelican Brief, which I remember that coming out. I didn't know that was him either. Because to me, that was always like, that's a quote unquote John Grisham movie, you know? And at that point in time was like the mid or early to mid 90s. Like once The Firm came out, it didn't really matter who made the film. It's just John Grisham. So you know what kind of story to expect or generally what you're going to get. Even though with those John Grisham movies, like there's a lot of highly acclaimed top tier filmmakers behind them. You know, The Firm of Sidney Pollack. There was, I think Francis Ford Coppola did one. Who else? And look, that's another one. I got an episode. I want to do a John Grisham episode. It's coming one of these days. But that's where, this documentary, it was good to kind of run through some of his films and the stories behind them and a lot of well-respected master actors and performers and industry people in this documentary talking about their work and their time with J Pakula. And I didn't realize just how revered he was as a filmmaker. I really didn't. Because his films aren't flashy, you know? They aren't the things that are blockbusters. They just aren't. That doesn't mean they don't have substance, but they're not the ones that just kind of fly high into the stratosphere. But they are the ones that maybe stand the test of time, you know? And so in this documentary, you get a chance to learn a little bit about him and his approach to filmmaking and story and his focus on the psychology of the characters and the psychology of what informs the things that happen in these stories. It's really interesting. I just didn't know that was his take on it. I didn't know him as a filmmaker. And of course, the tragic side to all of this is that he passed away. And not only that he passed away, but also such a just horrific, surprising way to go. And I don't even remember this happening in the news. I just wasn't paying attention. But to hear what happened to him and how it was so sudden and unnecessary. You know, he was killed in a freak car accident. And that's so tragic. Because here's someone who, by any other account, would still be going today probably. And would still probably have just as many interesting and meaningful stories to tell on film. And yet we'll never get to see that now. So I think if you're looking for some film history, you're looking for filmmakers who are not working from all accounts, are not working today, but have done some really interesting and masterful work over the past few decades. Check out these documentaries. Check out the films that are talked about in these documentaries, because I think they're pretty important. And so the last one I want to talk about here, Making Waves, this one's a little bit different. This is about filmmaking, But this kind of actually came to me because I watched this documentary series on Max, I think. It's called The Power of Film. And I think this originated like a Turner Classic Movies series, going through all the different types of elements of filmmaking and filmmakers throughout film history, right? So you've got everything going back to the early days, all the way up to today and the modern blockbuster and what that means in terms of stories, in terms of the types of characters and the motivations and performance, just everything. It really covers a lot of ground. And if you're interested in filmmaking, just in general, it's a really informative documentary, but it also is good at putting you on to some films that mattered, right? Films that still might hold up today for whatever reason. So this one is another that it's more about the technical side of filmmaking, but it does key you in on a few iconic, like milestone films and the people behind them. So this Making Waves, it is more about the evolution of sound and sound design and sound editing in film. And, it features a lot of important people in that line of work, whether it's someone like Walter Murch or Ben Burt, Gary Rydstrom, important sound editors and people who work on that side of the film industry, and how they either started their relationships with the directors and other filmmakers that they kind of came up with, but also how they pushed the form forward, how they evolved the technology, the techniques, and their importance for innovating, Now, that's the thing is you got to remember, so film, if we're talking about the beginning of film, we're talking about over 100 years ago, right? We're talking about easily the turn of the 20th century when film as a technology, as a storytelling medium was just starting out, but it was only visual. And it was very crude. It was somewhat primitive, People were still figuring it out. And so sound wasn't even part of the equation. Sound didn't really come into factor until a couple of decades later. And that is where I think this documentary tries to illustrate that. I think it takes this from being a little bit of a gimmick, a little bit of like a moving picture thing, into a real, true narrative storytelling medium. You can have music, you can have sound effects, you can have characters speaking, and you can find that nuance, that tone, that subtlety in a voice or in a mood or in a moment that only sound can convey, right? So I think that's where this documentary walks us through all of those points throughout the last, let's say, 100 years. Something from the addition of sound to the evolution into stereo sound, to surround sound, and then to the growth and the changes in sound effects and music, from score to editing to Foley and even ADR, all of the tricks and the techniques that are used to add sound and make sound an important part of a film. And look, if you just watch films, you just take sound for granted. But if you've ever tried to make a film, or even just make anything involving video that needs some audio component, you know that sound is not a given, right? It just doesn't happen. It has to be a part of the process. It has to be part of the workflow. It has to be something you prepare for. In this documentary, we get a few films that I just from my notes here, we have The Jazz Singer, which maybe is a little problematic. We have Gone with the Wind, also maybe doesn't hold up so well. But you have other films like Citizen Kane, even something like A Star is Born or Apocalypse Now, Star Wars, right? So many of these other films over the recent years that have shown like where sound is not only just an element, but it can take over the film. Like it can really dictate how you experience a film. And so this is a pretty useful documentary for knowing where and how these types of technological changes have happened. So, if you're interested in the more technical side of filmmaking, this is one that you definitely want to watch. You definitely want to learn about some of these people and some of the things that they did, but also watch these films and watch them the way they're supposed to be watched. If you're going to watch Apocalypse Now, don't watch it on your phone. Just don't do that. Watch it in a real surround sound setup. So, I don't know. I just wanted to get into a couple of these documentaries. I think these are kind of fun. For me, at least, I kind of nerd out watching this stuff, learning about filmmakers and their approach, the creative process, but also the technology and the way that they innovate. Because I think that's the interesting thing about film in general, is that it can come off like it's just this thing that happens. It's a little bit like just a magic thing, but there really is there's a lot of inventiveness. There's a lot of experience and skill and artistry that has to go into this to make it work. That magic is not actual magic, right? It's the illusion of magic. So, watch these if you like. And let me know, are there some other documentaries out there like this? I have a couple on my list that I want to get to at some point, but I thought they're kind of a like mind because they're about filmmakers and films of a similar era, from, let's say, the 60s up through the 90s. It's a very specific range of films and advances in films, and then filmmakers that were involved in those things. So check them out, see what you think. In the meantime, hey, you know what to do. It's filmstreak.com. You can go check out other episodes. I say this all the time, but I have a list of these films on IMDb. So that maybe is useful for you. So just keep in mind, there's plenty out there about the history of films and filmmaking. And go find it. Go learn about it. And go watch something new.